Professor Peter Berger, Professor of Religion, Sociology, and Theology Emeritus at Boston University, Director of the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, is a name most of you are familiar with, whose work really has been groundbreaking over the last generation. Works far too numerous to count. Remarkable how some are gifted by our Creator to write, and those who write a lot. The early works on the social construction of reality literally changed the face of sociology for many. The interest in sociology and religion, which is part of Professor Berger's profile, has also been a surprising element for many in the 20th century academy. The sacred canopy, the rumor of angels, suggested the loss of transcendence was taking place in some important way, which we would only learn about more as his own writings increased. The homeless mind, the heretical imperative, the impact of our social locations on our convictions, on our intellectual habits. The work with Samuel Huntington, a decade later, many globalizations, the way in which we bump into each other now, not simply across the street, but across the world, and its impact on how we hold on to our convictions. Professor Berger is also, as many of you know, recently a voluminous blogger. I would encourage you, if you haven't read the blog, to follow it. We'll pass around the link if you would like it. But just in this last month, he's addressed Islam, the papacy, religion, or maybe the lack thereof, in Canada, and global Pentecostalism. He's actually agreed to think out loud with us this afternoon about globalization and this phenomena of Pentecostalism, tradition which is very near to many of you in this room. I think it's not unfair to say he is the most oft-quoted sociologist among evangelicals. Kind of interesting. I think you'll see why a little bit in our conversation this afternoon. Profound influence on many of our own faculty. Professor Wells, Professor Singleton, Professor Horn, Professor Johnson, the list goes on and on. And so, though this is his first time here to campus, many of us think of him as a dear friend and colleague through his writings. He talked with a group of faculty this morning on the rise of religion in China. He could have spoken about the rise of Islam. He could have spoken about Pentecostalism in Latin America. He can speak about most anything with wisdom and with wit when it comes to social location and religious conviction. But today, he's going to hopefully provoke us to think more clearly, if also with more complexity, about the phenomena of the rise of Pentecostalism. So, with a warm welcome, let's say welcome to Professor Berger this afternoon.
Well, thank you for a very generous introduction. Yes, I did write many books, and one thing I try to encourage in my students is skepticism. And let me remind you, if you have somebody who wrote many books, chances are about half of them are wrong. So don't be impressed by the numbers of what I or anyone else wrote. It's what's in them. And some of the things I wrote some years ago I think were wrong. Maybe some things I'm writing today will turn out to be wrong a few years from now. Pentecostalism. This is what I'm asked to talk about. And let me quickly say I'm going to, whatever I say in the next half hour, 20 minutes, whatever, I'll speak as a sociologist, regardless of my own theological views. And I think I would say the same if I were, what I am is a Lutheran, but I'm not going to talk, which means that this is not my community. I don't believe that you have to be baptized by the Holy Spirit, as Pentecostals mean, in order to be a Christian. No. But as a sociologist, my own personal view of this is quite irrelevant. I could be a Buddhist or a Muslim or whatever, or an atheist, and I think I would come to the same conclusion. I've been fascinated by Pentecostalism for quite a while. I first came across it actually way back. I did my master's thesis on religion among Puerto Ricans in New York City. And Pentecostalism was the first time I came across it. I would go around East Harlem visiting one storefront church after another, and I was struck by many. And only later did I understand what I really was seeing. But I did understand it was significant and interesting. And later, especially as much of my work as a sociologist has involved what we now call the Global South, the massive reality of Pentecostalism in Latin America and Asia and Africa, and to some extent in parts of Asia, though not quite as dramatically as in Latin America and Africa. I think I would say without any hesitation that Pentecostalism must be the largest, the fastest growing movement in human history. The core phenomena of Pentecostalism have been around from the beginning, as already the name Pentecost suggests. Speaking in tongues, miracles, exorcism, prophecy, those are not new phenomena. They have been so throughout the history of Christianity and indeed in other religious traditions. But modern Pentecostalism, most people date from the early 20th century. There's some dispute of where it first erupted, probably most strongly in the United States. One date that people often give was an important event, though not the only one, was the so-called Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles, which happened in 1906. An African-American preacher came out of Kansas and started preaching in a stable in some slum area of Los Angeles, and within a short time had a congregation there, which then sent out missionaries all over the United States and sooner or later all over the world. The big explosion of Pentecostalism in what we now call the Global South, it was then called the Third World, I mean developing societies of Latin America, Asia, and Africa, occurred beginning in the 1950s in a massive way, and has gathered steam ever since. Now, a few years ago, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey of world Pentecostalism and arrived at the estimated figure of 600 million Pentecostals worldwide. I suspect that's an underestimate. I think it leaves out China pretty much, which is very significant. Anyway, I'm not concerned with numbers here. It's huge, very huge, and still growing. One of the pioneers of sociological study of Pentecostalism, our research center subsidized his earlier studies, which were in Latin America, is David Martin, a British sociologist, and incidentally a priest of the Church of England, which doesn't enter into his research, but it is, I think, in his, well, when you know him as a person, it's very important that he is that. He wrote a little booklet some years after he began his research. It's called The Revolution That Was Not Supposed to Happen. In other words, think particularly of Latin America, people expected a revolution. It was a socialist revolution, a revolution of the left, whatever. It didn't happen. What happened is the Pentecostal Revolution, which wasn't supposed to happen. And until recently, social scientists, observers of the scene, for example, in countries like Brazil, Guatemala, which are the two main explosions of Pentecostalism in Latin America, in terms of percentage of population, they didn't notice it because it's something they didn't understand and didn't like. And it's like the famous metaphor of the elephant in the living room. It's an elephant in the middle of the middle room, and people ignore it and just walk around it and pretend it isn't there. Well, the elephant has become so big and so noisy that it's almost impossible to ignore now. So even people who don't like this and are suspicious of it have been forced to acknowledge it. Okay, I have very limited time, so there are three basic questions one wants to ask. What is it? Why is it successful? And where is it going? The last one I'm sure I can't answer with any kind of authority, because nobody knows where anything is going, I think, these days. But the first two questions, I think one can answer with some assurance. What is it? It's not a monolithic phenomenon. There's one, if I could use the plural. There are Pentecostalisms. There are other words that have been used: charismatic Christianity, neo-Pentecostalism, revivalism, not a very happy term that some people have used, misleading actually. I think some of these distinctions don't make much sense. The phenomenon has changed over the years, of course. We talked about a little earlier about China, where you now have lots of middle-class people who became Christians in the Pentecostal way. In much of the world, it's still very poor people who make the core of Pentecostal recruitment. But I think the basic phenomenon is very similar. It's these core phenomena that I mentioned before: speaking in tongues, what they call baptism by the Holy Spirit, miraculous healing, very important, exorcism, prophecy. And that is the core around which some other things have been accumulated. And you even have what some people have rather nicely called Pentecostalization. It's spilling over into much more traditional religious communities. Even the Catholic Church has a charismatic movement, which is very similar in some aspects of Pentecostalism. The Russian Orthodox Church, no less, has a charismatic movement. So it's a very broad phenomenon, and one shouldn't be confused by it. You look at the center, what's the core of it, and I think I've mentioned the core. It's describable, and we know quite a bit about it. And the most interesting question is, why is it successful? What makes for its success? And I would say you have to look at a package of things. It's not a single reason, there's a package of things. Very important, it is unambiguously religious. It has to do with God, with Christ, with salvation, with eternal life. It is not a religious movement that translates itself immediately into politics or into psychotherapy of some sort. And that you can see very blatantly in Latin America, where for a while intellectuals thought the big movement is going to be liberation theology. Catholicism, also some Protestants adopted it. What is the core of the gospel? It is the uprising of the poor. It's the establishment of a just society, which to them meant a socialist society in some shape or form. Well, that is not the revolution that happened. You can count Cuba, if you like, or Venezuela, but those are very different phenomena from what the liberation theologians had in mind. It's the Pentecostal Revolution that happened. Not a political agenda, but at the core of it, a religious agenda. The baptism by the Holy Spirit and then speaking in tongues is not a political event. Nor is it psychotherapeutic. I mean, it may have therapeutic effects, but particularly liberal Protestantism has tended to look upon the core of Christianity being, it's good for you, it's good for mental health, perhaps even for physical health. It makes you a better husband or wife. That's not what Pentecostalism is at its core, nor is it at its core simply a morality. You should be a nice person, you should be, my colleague at Boston University, Nancy Ammerman, who's a sociologist of religion, has coined a very nice term for this in terms of American Christianity. She calls it golden rule Christianity. The core of Christianity is the golden rule. Don't do unto others, okay? Which actually is something that the great Rabbi Hillel formulated. Jesus quoted Hillel, but there are no footnotes in the New Testament. Yeah, who would want to quarrel with this? It's a wonderful moral teaching. But I don't think it's the core of Christianity. Christianity is something much more supernatural, something much more cosmic in its proposition about the world. And that's what attracts people, especially in a situation of rapid social change. And if you look at the global south, which is where most of the Pentecostal explosion has occurred, what do you have? You have a rapid modernization. You have the breakdown of traditional forms of social support, extended family, kinship, tribe, caste, all of that breaking down. You have these huge urban areas in these countries with masses of people coming from the outside, suddenly without the social support which they had where they came from. And here is a church which not only gives them religious nurturance, but takes care of them. I mean, I remember we had our most recent regional study. We have been doing this for now about 20 years. It was in South Africa. And there was a survey-type study, but lots of interview material. And one woman who became Pentecostal, I don't know what she was before, some kind of Protestant, I think, but not Pentecostal, said, oh, no, she was Catholic. And she said, well, if I didn't show up in church for a month, nobody will notice. If I don't show up in my Pentecostal church now, somebody comes and says asks if I'm all right. That kind of community is tremendously important in a situation of rapid change, poverty very often, difficult life, etc. David Martin coined the term betterment for this. In other words, Pentecostals are concerned with betterment, improving their life on every level, spiritual, physical, economic, social. That's a powerful package. And then comes what Martin calls the new Protestant ethic. What is the morality which Pentecostalism preached? Not as its core, but as what a good Christian should do and not do after baptism by the Holy Spirit. And it's very much what Max Weber, the great German sociologist of the 20th century, his most famous book is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. What is it? Hard work, saving, modest consumption, an interest in one's family, interest in the education of one's children. And you can see that in Latin America. Most dramatically, I've seen it. I mostly have been involved with the Latin American part of the research. Now, many people go to church and don't do what the preacher tells them to do. We know that. That's true of everybody, not just Pentecostals, Presbyterians, Baptists, you name it. But if they do what the preacher tells them, there are going to be effects. In fact, if you do all these things, and the economic environment is halfway benign, we know what the result is. We call it social mobility. You may not become rich, but you will improve your social position. You will at least come out of the most degrading and miserable poverty. I think this may become a little too abstract, so let me be more concrete. Let me talk about the South African research. We have a more recent study of middle-class Protestantism in several countries, which wasn't regional. We also dealt with China. But the last regional study we did was in South Africa. We always do it in collaboration with local institutions. We can't send researchers in from the outside who don't know languages and don't know the situation. So we worked with a research center in Johannesburg, run by a very remarkable woman whom I've known in connection with other projects. And she is, it's called the Center for Development and Enterprise in Johannesburg. She is English-speaking South African, Jewish, very secular. In fact, I once told her she's religiously tone-deaf. But she got so excited by the Pentecostals, she's been going around the country telling government people and business people, listen, this is very important. We have to look at these people. This is social capital. This is important for the development of the country. She understood this. Well, let me tell you one. Well, it was a fascinating project where our researchers decided, they estimated that 1 in 5 South Africans is Pentecostal today. Not only blacks, also mixed race people, quite a few whites. Very interesting. Probably correct estimate. When we finished the study, it was published in South Africa. I don't think it was published elsewhere. Very interesting study. The main researcher died in the meantime, very sad. But we had a press conference, and then several of us, including Ann Bernstein, this woman, went to a big Pentecostal mega church. Well, saying the same thing twice. Mega church means a very big church in a suburb of Johannesburg on a Sunday morning. They claim 30,000 members. They have 4 services every Sunday. We went there. There were about big kind of garage-like warehouse-type building. There were about 7,000 people there, we guessed. I believe the number of 30,000. It's very interesting. It's mixed race, in fact, interesting, a mixture of races, not mixed race in the sense of South African sense, but in a general, there were about, I would say, 85% black South Africans, and 15% whites, Indians, mixed race, which is about the percentage in the general population. So it was racially very representative of the country. Class-wise, obviously, it contained some quite well-to-do people, and some who were not well-to-do at all. You could see this. We had a car, and we came in the parking lot. You had some BMWs, some Mercedes, and then you had buses where people were brought in from the townships outside Johannesburg. So it was interracial, it was interclass, intergender. You had, usually in most religious groups, women are more numerous than men. That was there too, but there were lots of men. Age-wise, it was old people and young people. It was a very interesting mix. Okay? As I said, that was the racial composition of the congregation. The preacher at that time, I think he's still there, is white. By background, a bodybuilder, sort of Pentecostal Schwarzenegger. And we had, as in many Pentecostal services, there was about an hour or so of music and praying and people speaking in tongues and dancing. And after our ears were almost damaged for life by this explosion of noise, he started to preach. Very powerful preaching. And he had simply 2 messages. He talked about salvation, baptism in the Spirit, what does it mean to be a Christian. But what were his messages in terms of social life? He said, God does not intend you to be poor. 2, you can do something about it. Okay? Now that contrasts very nicely with the Roman Catholic concept of preferential option for the poor. Am I going over my time? Okay. I'll jump from South Africa to Brazil. I'll come back to South Africa because interesting what happened after we finished, the sermon was finished. I had a student some years ago, a woman from Brazil, who was Roman Catholic. I think she still is. She's now a professor. She did a doctorate with me in the United States, back at Boston University. She's Roman Catholic, but she made a study of Pentecostals and base communities, or liberation theology communities in Recife, in the northeast of Brazil, which is the poorest region of the country. She also studied members of Brazilian African cults, kind of voodoo type things. That doesn't enter much into her thesis. Mainly she compared these liberation theology Catholics and Pentecostals. And she found to her dismay that, because she's Roman Catholic, that the Pentecostals were much better at coping with poverty and getting out of it. And she had one paragraph. Some of you are familiar with the concept of preferential option for the poor. It's now official Roman Catholic doctrine. And she had this paragraph. I think I can quote it verbatim. The Roman Catholic Church proposes a preferential option for the poor. The grammar of this sentence assumes that the church itself is not poor. It's for the poor, okay? not of the poor, it's for the poor, like this. The Pentecostal church is poor, certainly in the Recife, and that is why the poor opt for it. And when I read that, I said, on that basis of that paragraph, she deserves a PhD in sociology. Because that explains an awful lot, okay? Now let me jump back to Africa. After our ears, so we could hear each other anymore, we left, went through this wonderful parking lot into our car, and something else happened. Before we left the building, attached to the church is a business school. It was Sunday morning, the school was closed, but they had a pamphlet there, not exactly a catalog, but a pamphlet. So we could see what the curriculum was. Obviously, they don't train people for a career in a multinational corporation. They train people how to run a small business, how to run a beauty parlor or a garage, or what are the legal requirements, how do you pay taxes, how do you labor laws, very concrete stuff in terms of small enterprise. That's terribly significant. So when we left, I'm now back with a group going back to our car, including Anne, and we turned to each other. Any of us disapprove of this message of his? Forget the theological part, but the advice he gave. And we said no to each other. We wouldn't quarrel with this. God doesn't want people to be poor. I think any Christian would say, if you are poor, God will be with you. He will not abandon you. But God doesn't want you to be poor, any more than He wants you to be sick. If you're sick, there are remedies for being sick in your religion, but it's not God's will that you should be sick and poor. And there is something you can do about being poor. And their business school told them the kind of thing they should do. Well, I think that explains what is happening, I think. And I could go on for hours about this, but that's not what this program is, and you will get angry if I talk much longer. Last question is, where is it going? I'm very suspicious of predictions. Most predictions I made as a sociologist have turned out to be wrong. So I've become very, very careful about making predictions. I will simply say what is a very important question. As Pentecostalism, that's what we addressed but didn't have a definitive answer in our last study, which had to do with middle-class Pentecostalism. How will it change Pentecostalism? Will it retain its core, or will it become as boring as most other denominations, like mine? Well, one doesn't know, but there are some indications of where it is going. And I would say, what I have seen and read, the core of Pentecostalism, which is the religious part of the package, is maintained over several generations. Some other things are less permanent. I would expect that the miraculous part will diminish a bit. Speaking with tongues, people who go through higher education and have middle-class status are a little more sedate in their expression of religious emotions. I'm not sure of this, but I think that's the direction in which it is going. Will it continue to grow? Probably. I don't think it could continue growing as dramatically as it has, let's say, since World War II. At that rate, almost everyone would be Pentecostal before the end of the century, which is not going to happen. But I don't think it has reached a definitive plateau internationally.
Let me just kick off our questions quickly here, and then we'll turn it to the audience. You have taught many of us that modernization is not necessarily hostile to religious faith, and I take it that the example of Pentecostalism is proof positive. But many thoughtful Pentecostals, letting you repeat some things you've said earlier yesterday and this morning, have been worried about some of the prosperity themes that resonate in some sectors of the Pentecostal tradition. Is it a good thing to be worried about those themes?
I wouldn't worry about it at all. Look, there are two interpretations of Pentecostalism. We talked about that. There's what I call the cargo cult interpretation. Cargo cult was a religious movement in the South Pacific in the early 20th century, where there were some, I think it was one or several prophets who said, if you give money to me and have faith in me, God will make you rich. And they had, part of the belief was ships and aeroplanes will come and drop all the good things of modernity on you. Automobiles, telephones, refrigerators, electric shavers, everything. You don't have to do anything, just give me money and have faith and it'll come to you. There are some interpreters of Pentecostalism who say it's a new cargo cult. Others, like David Martin, we sponsored his original work in Latin America, a British sociologist. He said, well, there may be some, but basically it's a new Protestant ethic. It's hard work. Max Weber argued that, I think correctly, that this Protestant ethic was an important factor in the birth of modern capitalism and the modern economy. Now, if we are talking about 600 million or more people, I would guess there would be both types. The cargo cult types, those who simply give money to the preacher and do nothing else in terms of their behavior, I don't think they will become rich. I don't think that belief is empirically correct. The ones who follow the preacher who says, work hard, don't beat up your wife, educate your children, etc., are much more likely to be successful and therefore important. So I don't worry about this. Now, I would worry if my, a close friend of mine went to a cargo cult congregation and became poor as a result of giving all his money to this preacher. But generally speaking, no, I wouldn't worry about it.
Let me open up questions from the floor. No more than 3 or maybe 4 sentences forms a really good question. Who wants to begin? Did you all hear that in the back? Do the prosperity themes cut across not only Pentecostalism, but other Protestant Christian bodies as well to this same effect?
Gee, that's a very big question. I'm not sure I can have a kind of overview of all possible denominations where this would be a factor. Yeah, sure, it could be. I mean, and I would say the same thing about it. Now, if you want to make theological judgments, certainly the cargo cult idea is a distortion of Christianity. I mean, Christianity is not about becoming rich, let alone becoming rich because you give money to some preacher and have faith in him. I mean, it's usually a him, sometimes a her, but most of these characters are men. But if you take the Protestant ethic interpretation of Pentecostalism, sure, I mean, if people think that this is what Christianity is all about, you would also say that's a distortion of the gospel, I would say. But that wasn't the case with this preacher in Johannesburg. He didn't say this is what Christianity is all about. He just said, if you do this, you'll be less poor. And he's right. So I'm sorry, but it's not one of my big worries in the world is the prosperity gospel.
Another question. There's some microphones going to circulate around.
I wonder if you could talk about the role of women in Pentecostalism and what...
Role of men?
Women.
Women.
The role of women in Pentecostalism and what that has done to change society, enact societal change, just the role of women in general in the movement.
Okay, I know most about what happened in Latin America where it's crystal clear. My impression is, especially from a South African study, it's not that different in Africa. Not just South Africa, throughout sub-Saharan Africa. Martin's wife is also a sociologist, and she's particularly focused on women in Pentecostalism. And she argues that basically Pentecostalism is a movement of women's emancipation. And I think she's right. In Latin America, it's an anti-machismo movement. There is a rich Latin American tradition of maleness. A wonderful sentence in Spanish, hay que ser hombre, one has to be a man. And that means having 5 mistresses and drinking a lot and never being home, okay? Pentecostalism agitates against that. Martin put it very nicely. Pentecostalism took men out of the street and put them into the kitchen. And in terms of actual behavior, most preachers are men. Not all, but most. Partly because they have a rather literalist interpretation of the Bible. So it says in the New Testament, women should, Paul, in one of his letters, should remain silent in the congregation or something. And they follow that. The women run the place. They are the missionaries, they are the organizers, they take care of the children in the congregation. And in many ways, they're more powerful than the men. And some of the interview material is, they talk of the men rather disdainfully. Yeah, let them be up there and strut around and preach, but it's we who really run the place. Now, the contrast with general Latin American culture is very sharp. And I think it's not too different in Africa. I know less about Asia in that respect. It's not just China, it's the Philippines, and I'm less sure of that.
Another question.
Hi, could you describe what you see as some of the indirect political implications of Pentecostalism?
Indirect what?
Indirect political implications of Pentecostalism, its rise today and perhaps in the future?
You cannot say in Latin America or in Africa that it's either predominantly right-wing or left-wing. It's not basically a political movement, but it has become, in some countries, so important that politicians cannot ignore it. Brazil and Guatemala are the 2 Latin American countries with the highest percentage of Pentecostals in the population. Guatemala has had 1 Pentecostal president and I think 1 other, at least, candidate. The one who was president has a very bad record in terms of human rights. He taught Sunday school on Sunday and he tortured people during the week or something like that. But one of the people I met, I think he was defeated in the election. He was running for president. He's a pastor of a Pentecostal megachurch in Guatemala City and committed Democrat, with a small d. So that's a very mixed record in terms of actual party politics. But, and that's a point that David Martin has been emphasizing, he calls it a school for democracy. Because these are institutions that come from below, and it's people who never had constitutions of their own making who now make an institution. In the church, there's no hierarchy. It comes from within the congregation. Now, that's not politically democratic, but it's potentially, I think saying it's a school for democracy is not a bad way of putting it. And in the long run, I would say in Latin America, it's very clear. Pentecostalism is a democratizing force.
To what degree do you think Pentecostalism affect the Church of China?
Is Pentecostalism a significant force in the church in China?
Well, I'm sure it's a significant force. The question is, how significant is it? And people who know more about China than I would say that the big growth in middle-class Protestantism in China was very interesting. Pentecostalism is less important or less central. It's Christian. It's most of it is quite evangelical, but not so much Pentecostal.
Right?
How has the Pentecostal movement affect other traditions, like Presbyterians, Lutherans?
Yes, there is a spillover effect, and I think I mentioned the term before. It's a good term, Pentecostalization. In other words, There are Pentecostal-type phenomena in mainline Protestant denominations, in the Catholic Church, and even in Eastern Christian Orthodoxy. Not as majority phenomena, but visible. And so the answer to your question is yes, it spills over.
Is Pentecostalism feared by those in the academy as a return of the repressed, a return to kind of naturalized religion?
Well, yes, and I mean, in the academy, in the media, there is a very strong secular discourse, which is not necessarily hostile to religion, but doesn't know what to do with it. So, I mean, a reporter for the Boston Globe, take it as a prototype of the kind of person you're thinking of, knows what to do with Martin Luther King, who had a political agenda, which, of course, he approved. He knows what to do with, I don't know, a Presbyterian church that runs some kind of program in the inner city. That's fine. But he doesn't know what to do with these Pentecostals who heal the sick and have miracles. But return of the repressed is not quite the right term, because it doesn't. He's the one, the reporter, who repressed all of this, and it isn't returning in him. He has difficulty dealing with it outside himself or his own immediate milieu. I like telling stories. I'm thinking of the South African project. At the end of the project, the day before we went to the Pentecostal megachurch, we had a press conference. And as is typical in South Africa today, the majority of the reporters were black. There was a significant minority of white journalists. And the white journalists were immensely interested, and some of them had never heard of this. The black reporters, the whites left after the end of the press conference. Some of the black journalists stayed behind, and it turns out, I don't think any one of them was Pentecostal, but members of their family were. They knew all about it. They were not surprised, and they wanted to talk more about it. This really doesn't touch on your question. I was just free-associating.
Share a little bit of from the blog 2 days ago of the contrast between Riverside and Orlando.
Well, my blog of this week actually was last Wednesday, or yesterday it went up, Wednesday. And if you want to read my blog, I think there's a passage somewhere in the Talmud which says, if you don't advertise your blog, who will? You can find it very quickly. You go to the website of The American Interest, which is a journal published in Washington on politics and culture. And you have my name there, my blog. I usually like to latch on to something that's I read in some news. And I think it was in the Christian Century, there was a report on the annual convention of the Assemblies of God in the United States in Orlando. Interestingly enough, where the Disney World is located, very middle American place. And he noted a slight increase in numbers of the denomination, Pentecostal denomination, but what particularly interested him was among young people. Lots of young people seem to be drawn to the Assemblies of God, which is not typical of other Protestant denominations. And that was interesting. And in the same issue of the periodical, there was an advertisement from the Riverside Church in New York. It's a sort of the cathedral of liberal Protestantism in New York. There's the same part of the Upper West Side, which contains Union Seminary and the offices of the National Council of Churches, the center of liberal Protestantism. And they were advertising for a senior pastor, and they had the qualifications they were looking for. Some of what you'd expect, someone with experience, knowing managerial capacities, ability to talk to different kinds of people, well, very sensible. Then at the bottom it had a phrase, some of which is actually mandated now by law, that employment at the Riverside Church is without regard to sex, race, sexual orientation, victim of marital abuse. I understand this. They prefer victim of marital abuse, so they don't discriminate against. I don't know. Anyway, it was that. But what made me jump out of the chair was among the what they were not going to take into consideration was religion, irrespective of race, color, sexual orientation, or religion. Any religion, no religion. What religious qualifications are there for a senior pastor in the Riverside Church? And when I say this in my blog, for a moment I'm not an investigative reporter, but for a moment I started calling them up and asking one of the staff people, what do you mean by religion not being taken into account? And then I went to the internet and there was a full description of what they want. It was very clear. It was an agenda of political correctness. They didn't want a Tea Party Republican. That was clear enough. They didn't want any kind of Republican. Well, the Upper West Side is a sort of concentrated place for liberal Protestantism and left liberalism in general. And Disney World is, I think, a kind of center for middle American centrist, and so many evangelicals, I'm sure, because of its location are there. Maybe some, almost certainly some Pentecostals. That was this week's blog. I haven't yet written last week.
One or two more questions.
You said that the religious affection in America is subdued. Do you think
what?
Religious expressions in America is generally subdued? And do you think that the dramatic expressions found in Africa and South America enhance the spiritual experience?
I didn't get the last
Will the
part of it.
influence be from the global south to the west
Oh, I see what you mean.
in intensity of religious emotion?
It might. It might. But also this is mainly through immigrants. And so far, and I think it was yesterday, I told an episode, I was lecturing in Dublin, in Ireland. This was about 2 years ago. And on the way back to Boston, I read the Irish Times, and they had a story there was a big rally of Pentecostals in Dublin. 10,000 Pentecostals had a gathering in Dublin, and they were almost all Africans. And the preacher was, I think, from Nigeria. And most of Pentecostalism in Europe now is immigrants, African, Latin American, Caribbean kind of thing. But the preacher said, Ireland is a wonderful country. We're very happy to be here, and we welcome everybody to come into our services, no matter what their race. And the reporter, who didn't know what to make of this, reported with some unease of it. There were some white Irish people who were attending the service. And he said, mostly elderly people. Is more of this going to happen? Could be. I don't think it'll radically change the nature of religion in Europe or in America, but some of it is happening.
Final question.
You described the Protestant global Pentecostalism as a new Protestant ethic, and I was wondering, are there any major differences between this new Protestant ethic and Max Weber's original work?
Yes, there are significant differences. First of all, the Protestant ethic that Weber was describing was predominantly Calvinist with a strong Calvinist doctrine. In fact, he put a lot of emphasis on double predestination, a very characteristic Calvinist doctrine. That's not the case with Pentecostalism. In fact, doctrine is not terribly important to them. Insofar as they have doctrine, it's a conservative evangelical theology. Very clear in terms of scripture. They take a very literal, use a term, they would do inerrant approach to the scripture. I mentioned it in connection with women keeping silent in the congregation, also other things. But that's not central. And it's much more spontaneous. The Spirit moves where it wills. It's very different from the original Protestant ethic that Weber was writing about. So what is similar is the morality it encourages. And I think it is having roughly comparable effects.
Sensing the movement of the Spirit that calls us to order and calls us to conclusion, I'm going to draw
So let
us...
me in conclusion tell you the only Pentecostal joke I know.
The only Pentecostal joke. Professor Berger actually has written on comedy and religion. And so a fitting way maybe to close our session today.
I thought how I should conclude. Maybe there are other Pentecostal jokes. It's the only one I know. You have a meeting of Pentecostals and you want to go in and find out how many of them want coffee during the break. So you go in and say, all those who want coffee during the break, please lower your hands.
And all those who are deeply appreciative, let's put our